So for those of you who are not aware, there was an election last week. I called my friend Chip Rogers to come back on and explain to us what's just happened, both up and down ballot, and how that's going to impact us in the hospitality industry. Go America. Hey, Chip, thanks for coming on Teague Talks. I couldn't have thought of a better friend to call to explain what the heck's going on, what all the election results mean, all the up ballot, down ballot, etc. So please, please, please educate us. Tell us what's going on.
I will do my best. First, thanks, Teague. It's always great to be with you. Good to see you again. Looking forward to Hunter coming up in a few months.
So
in my hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, where I know events are still happening, and the weather is always nice. Look, it was a really interesting election season that was truncated in many ways, of course, by everything that's happening with COVID. I mean, for many of us, we didn't really even start paying too much attention until just a few days before the election, because so much focus has been on what's happening with COVID and was Congress going to pass something or not. But before we get into all the details, the best way I could characterize it is this. The country is ideologically probably further split than ever before. And what I mean by that is the people on the right are as far to the right as they've been, and the people on the left are certainly as far left as they've ever been. But if you took the total country, and you'll see this in the numbers that we show and how the elections played out, it is almost split right down the middle. And we see that in Congress, we see it in the presidential election, we certainly see it at the state legislature level. So we'll talk about all that, but yeah, it's really close.
So that feels like a good place to be, right? Sort of in the middle, balance of power. Even though it didn't feel good, we feel very polarized at the moment. But
it would be a good place to be if two things weren't in place. Number one, if the ideologies of the parties weren't so far apart. And that's, I think, somewhat problematic. There's not a lot of people meeting in the middle, even though the division is 50-50, and you would think that would cause us to do that. The second thing is we're in nonstop campaign mode. I mean, you know, even though most people across the country are thinking the election's over, as you know, in Georgia, that state's about to get hit with $1 billion, and yes, I said billion with a B, $1 billion worth of advertising over the next 9 weeks, as for the first time in U.S. history, you have 2 U.S. Senate runoffs happening in the same state over a 9-week period.
I don't want it. Can I leave?
Yeah, I mean, you can't turn on the television. It's nauseating to turn on the television or the radio, because that is all you hear. And so many of the ads are just completely deceptive. And I'm not going to say which candidate it was, but because I spend a good portion of my time, almost half my time in the Atlanta area, I get all that information. There was a congressional race where I had specific, and I mean very specific, knowledge about the information that one of the campaigns was putting out. And I can say it was an abject lie. I mean, it wasn't even close to the truth. But I'm not going to get into that, but that is so common among all these campaigns. It's just so hard to tell what's the truth and what is not.
Yeah, I don't know. The cynic in me says that's been happening for generations.
True. Very true.
But we'd like to be in a better place, right, where we at least tell the truth. But that's not the case. That's not where we are.
And the problem is, as you know, is we've gone so far away from policy, and that's what's so frustrating to many of us. At the end of the day, the only thing I care that a politician does, I don't necessarily care that they're a good person or a bad person. Now, let me be clear. I want them to be a good person. Don't get me wrong. That's not what I'm suggesting. But the lasting implications on my life, our industry's life, everyone's life, are the policy decisions that they make. You know, if someone is a bad person, sometimes they're not going to be in office, but the policies they create will last for generations. And that's why it's so important to focus on those policies. And sadly, during these elections, it's nothing but personal attacks and very little interest in policy.
Well, and the world we've created feels like such a media-driven, dare I say, social media-driven world. It's all a headline world that we're in. The substance doesn't really matter. It's what's the headline.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. I'm again not choosing sides here, but I think if you look at the most recent presidential race, and we'll talk about that, I think generally most Americans would say to themselves, a vast majority would probably say to themselves, you know, just as far as a decent human being, they prefer Joe Biden over Donald Trump. But then if you look into the policies, I think most Americans, if you took away the names, would say, oh, the Trump policies seem to be something I'm more aligned with. And that's the debate we've been in, is it's personality versus policies. And again, I'm not trying to make a public statement one way or the other, but I think that race in particular kind of highlighted some of the differences the country sees.
All right, so let's get a good person to give us some good, strong economic policies.
That's what we need, exactly. Somebody that we can trust, somebody we like, but somebody that's right on the policies.
All right, we'll let you run whenever you're ready.
No more for me. No Mosses. No Mosses. Roberto Duran said so many years ago.
You're smart. Oh, well. All right, let's get into it. Tell me, go up ballot, down ballot. Tell me what we learned and how it's going to impact us at a local level, specifically in our hospitality industry.
Well, let's start with the presidential race. If you go back and look at the 2016 race between Trump and Ms. Clinton, you can see that it was decided by a handful of states with very, very, very tight margins in those states. If you look at the 2020 race, the exact same thing happened again. You have Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, which were the battleground states, and all of them decided by a handful of votes. Now, of course, the complicating factor here is that we really voted in almost a completely new way. Never before has the country seen mail-in voting happen the way that it happened now. We've never seen voting that started almost months in advance, at least multiple weeks in advance, and lasted beyond the election day as far as the counting process is concerned. So it causes concern for people. I don't know long-term if this is good for the electorate, that we have a voting period that lasts that long. We certainly need to encourage as many people to vote as possible. We may need a national holiday on election day, but I think it's good for the country that we kind of narrow that window a little bit and do this in a more orderly fashion so that there aren't accusations of bad things happening. Nonetheless, that's what we're faced with. So the point being is the country is very, very divided. If you told me and said, Chip, here are 200,000 votes, change them either way that you want. With 200,000 votes among the more than 100 million cast, I could change the election one way or the other. That's how tight it is. So if you look at the presidential level and the number of people that are voting in the battleground states, it was so tight that a few votes either way could have changed it. But at this moment, it looks like we have a president-elect Joe Biden, and certainly we wish him well. I mean, this is the frustrating thing in our country that we've seen happen over the last 20 years that we didn't see, Teague, when you and I were kids. When the president won back in the day, everybody was on his side, because there've only been males that have been elected, but on his side, and said, look, it's good for the country if the president does well. I hope someday we can get back to that. No one should wish that the president doesn't do well. It's good for our entire country to say, look, our country succeeds when our president succeeds.
Yeah, again, just part of the world we get in. But maybe Joe's the right guy to bring everybody back together. Who knows? He's got a tough job ahead of him because he's going to get it on both sides, even in his own caucus. They're coming after him. So I wish the best luck. I really do.
No, you're right, and I hope he moderates some of his views. During the campaign, he had some views that were quite concerning to us, and I know we're going to get into those things that impact our industry in just a minute, but particularly around organized labor. He's got some views that are dramatically different from not just President Trump, but most presidents in recent history. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. Now we go to the Senate race. We highlighted a few moments ago the situation in Georgia. I'll get to that in just a second. But essentially, the Democrats did not perform as well as they had expected in those U.S. Senate races. If you looked at the polls going into it, and I'm going to use Maine as an example, there was not a poll in Maine that showed Susan Collins winning. In fact, most polls showed her losing by double digits, and yet she wins by almost double digits. Now, that is probably, as my friend Frank Luntz would say, a complete indictment of our polling system. And polling may be gone. I mean, it may not work anymore. But I'll tell you the problem with that is that early polling determines momentum, and momentum determines fundraising. Fundraising determines the money, of course, that are spent in certain areas. And so it still plays a role, but man, it just doesn't seem to be accurate anymore. So the Democrats did not pick up the seats they wanted. One of the big pickups they really needed was in North Carolina. If you're following that race, you know some of the things that happened there with the Democrat candidate and some of the things of infidelity and him being a military officer, and that probably lost that race for them. So the Republicans will go into the Georgia runoffs with 50 seats. Now, if the Democrats were to win both Georgia runoff seats, it would put it at 50-50, and Vice President Harris would then break the ties that you have in the Senate. But it would be almost impossible to navigate through the Senate on just a day-to-day basis with an exact 50-50 tie. But we may ultimately see that. Now, I don't think you're going to see that. I think the Republicans win one, perhaps both races in Georgia. Keep in mind that the Georgia law is that you have to have 50% plus one vote. So you have to have a majority to win an election in Georgia. Senator Perdue fell just shy of that number, a few thousand votes under the 50%. And there was a Libertarian candidate in that race that got about 2.5% of the vote. Now, historically in Georgia with the Libertarian candidates, they've done some post-election analysis, and they've shown that the Libertarian candidates usually draw about 80% from Republican and about 20% from Democrat. So if that holds and those 80% votes go towards the Republican, you would expect at least Senator Perdue to be victorious. In the other race, which was the race to fill the seat of Johnny Isakson, who left the Senate because of health reasons, you had 20 candidates involved. So everybody knew that was going to run off, because with 20 candidates, you're not going to get 50%. And so you had three major candidates, which was Mr. Warnock on the Democrat side. You had Senator Loeffler, the incumbent, who had been placed into that position by Governor Brian Kemp. And then you had a member from the House of Representatives, Doug Collins. Those three candidates all got above 20%. Those are the three major candidates. It's now in a runoff between Loeffler and Warnock, and we'll see what happens there. I think in a way it does help the Republicans that Loeffler was the winner, because the Republicans have been suffering with women vote in the metro Atlanta area. And she would probably appeal more to women vote than Congressman Collins would. That's just an assumption on my part. And so that's kind of the foundation of those two races in Georgia, which could ultimately decide the power in the U.S. Senate.
You're so smart, and now feels the first election where we have the touch screen U.S. maps, and we all know more about counties in Arizona and Michigan and Georgia than we ever wanted to.
Well, it's tough in Georgia because there's 159 counties, and I'll give you everybody one little bit of trivia knowledge that I have on the state of Georgia with the counties. People often ask, why are there so many counties in the state of Georgia? The law, when it was written to create the counties in Georgia, was that a man had to be able to ride on his horse from wherever he resided to the county seat and back in a single day. And so that's why the counties were created so small. We then, of course, and some who really know Georgia, and yourself included, Teague, because I believe you might live in this county, in Fulton County, Georgia, there was, back during the Depression, two of those counties merged with Fulton County, which is the city of Atlanta. And that's why that one particular county is so large and doesn't fall into the man on a horse analogy that I stated a few moments ago. But yeah, 159 counties in Georgia, some of them extremely small.
All right, man on a horse. I'm going to try to see how far I can make it on a horse tomorrow when we finish this.
I guess it depends on how fast the horse is, right?
I like it. All right, keep going. Keep going.
All right, U.S. House of Representatives. This, to me, was the biggest surprise of the night. I think everybody knew that the Biden-Trump race would probably be close and would come down to those states that I mentioned a moment ago. I think most people figured that the U.S. Senate would break one way or the other by a seat or two, and that may still very well happen. The one that is most interesting is that most of the prognosticators predicted that the Democrats would pick up about a dozen seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. When all is said and done and the dust settles and all the votes are counted, it looks like the Republicans are probably going to pick up somewhere between 5 and 10 seats. And it looks like that when the members of Congress come back to Washington, D.C., the Democrats are going to have a advantage of anywhere from about 8 to 12 seats among those 435 members. Now, that is very, very difficult to navigate for anyone. Speaker Pelosi, whether you agree with her policies or not, whether you like her or not, and about half the country does and about half the country doesn't, you have to give her credit. She's very skillful at what she does in managing the House of Representatives. So I know there's a lot of discussion on the fact that the Democrats lost seats and that her position as Speaker might be tough for her to get reelected to. I put the chances of that happening at very slim. She has helped a lot of people over a lot of years, and I think she will retain her speakership. But it will be very difficult for her to navigate a very slim margin. Keep in mind, the House of Representatives almost always has 1 or 2 vacancies. Somebody gets sick, somebody unfortunately might pass away. There may be all sorts of reasons that there's 1 or 2 seats that are open. And so when you look at a slim majority of somewhere between 8 and 12 seats, it's going to be very difficult. But for all of us that kind of find our policies to be right down the middle, it may in fact be good because more deals should be cut. She'll need to work with Republicans on certain issues to get things done. And that's probably a very good thing. Now, the last thing I'm going to say about this, which I think is really, really important, I know we're going to get into state legislatures in a minute, but we are heading into what's known as reapportionment. Now, if you think political fighting is difficult during the 9 out of 10 years that we're not doing reapportionment, I can promise you that reapportionment is the most political process you could ever imagine because it's politicians drawing their own district lines. Now, of course, U.S. senators don't need to worry about this, but the U.S. representatives and the president needs to worry about this because you're going to see a shift because of the census of the number of members of Congress shifting, particularly from the Northeast and the upper Midwest down to the South, from Arizona to Florida, to Texas, to Georgia, to North Carolina, which will be picking up more representatives. Now, the process over the next year at the state legislature level will be for those representatives to draw the lines for the next seats in Congress, which will be up in 2 years. And if you think about those states in Texas, in Florida, and in Georgia in particular, and maybe even Arizona, usually those states are pretty reliably Republican states, maybe not so much in Georgia anymore, but the Republicans still control the legislature. So you are looking at a situation where that 8 to 12 seat margin may shrink even more in 2 years. The Republicans might have a chance to take over because of reapportionment. So there is going to be a lot of political pressure just over the next 2 years during the reapportionment process.
Yeah, that sounds like a train wreck.
It's not easy.
All right, so keep going. So tell me what's happened down at the state level.
Great segue there. So it was almost status quo, but there were some significant pickups for the Republicans. So the way I like to break the map down is between what you would consider red trifectas, blue trifectas, and those states in the middle. And what I mean by that is a blue trifecta, or any trifecta, means that the same party has control of that state's House, Senate, and governor's mansion. So as we went into this election, there were 15 states that had the blue trifecta. Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the governor. There were 20 states that had the red trifecta. Republicans control the House, Senate, and governor. Over this election, the Republicans picked up 3 additional trifectas. So now there are 15 blue states, 23 red states. Now, the reason this is so important is because legislation in a state like that can be introduced on say a Monday and be made into state law by a Friday because the same party has control of the entire process. You can introduce it in the House, it can go through the House, through the Senate, and have the governor sign it almost within a week in many states. That is very, very important because, when we think about legislation, the process really is that you hear about it, you begin to talk to people about it, you begin to form an opinion on it, you then form a policy projection on it, and then you start forming a plan on how you're going to implement that policy, and that takes a long time. But if something can be introduced on a Monday and be in law by Friday, it's very difficult to go through that process, and that's why it's so important to have people on the ground in those states with their ear to the ground, understanding what is happening. Something really bad can happen almost instantaneously. I will take you back, Teague, and you will definitely remember this, to about, I want to say maybe 8 or 9 years ago, within a 3-day process, the state of Georgia implemented a $5 hotel tax, $5 a night per room hotel tax, and that happened in 3 days. So it can happen. We've seen it happen. And when you have these states that are all one color, it can happen rather quickly.
And you just mentioned that seems more like the norm at the state level, though. They're all one way or all the other.
Yeah, you're looking at, 38 states.
Right.
So there's only 12 states that aren't one way or the other. But those 38 states, they're either red or blue, mainly red right now, 23 to 15, about 2/3 red. But yeah, those things can happen quickly.
All right. I mean, I don't know what I'm pulling for at that level, but
well, it impacts us, and particularly a state like California, where you have such a large percentage of America's hotels right in that one state. I mean, if you look at Florida, Texas, and California, just those 3 states alone, and combine the number of hotels, you're probably talking about close to half the hotels in the U.S.
Yeah, that's a lot.
And all three states are, California's all blue and Texas and Florida are all red. So certainly something to keep in mind. There were
All right.
some ballot measures, if you want me to
Yeah.
talk about those, I think are really important.
Yeah, let's definitely talk about ballot measures. One I'm thinking of that comes to mind is the Florida minimum wage, but I know there
Right.
was several in California. And
Yeah. So here's what I think is most interesting. Again, I think the things that pollsters missed the most was the House of Representatives, where the Republicans were supposed to lose seats and they picked up seats. I think the most interesting takeaway is really what happened at the state level on ballot measures.
Mhm.
So you think about a state like, I'm going to use California as the best example. You think about a state like California, where every single elected office is held statewide is held by a Democrat. They have super majorities in both the House of Representatives and the state Senate in California. So the Republicans have zero influence whatsoever in California. So what did they put on the ballot? They put on the ballot a thing called split roll. Now, many, many, many years ago in California, they created a property tax assessment process that says once you buy a piece of property, you're not going to get reassessed at a higher value until such time as that property changes ownership again. And that has been extremely popular for people in California because their assessments aren't going up. Now, millage rate could go up, so your taxes could still go up, but your assessment is not going up. Well, this year they put on the ballot what's called split roll to say that under residential properties that would maintain. But under non-residential properties, which of course all commercial properties, all hotels, restaurants, and everything else, that those assessments would go up on a yearly basis. The reason that is so important, I was talking to some of my friends that have hotels there. One of my friends said that his assessment would probably go up over 400% because the property has been with his family for many decades. So think about getting a new property tax bill that's over 400% larger than the one you have now at a time when you're just struggling to make it. Now, again, we're talking about California. The unions were 100% behind this. The teachers unions, especially behind this. All the government employees were behind this, and yet it lost. And so that was a big victory for our side, who said this is the worst time to have a massive tax increase. But you think about an all blue state that votes down a tax increase, and that was an important victory in the state of California. A second important victory in the state of California is on the issue of independent contractors. The legislature and the governor there had worked out a deal where they wanted to make all the independent contractors, think about Uber and Lyft specifically, but any independent contractor, force them to become employees where they had all of the healthcare, all of the benefits of employees, but of course the hours of employees and everything else. Well, Uber and Lyft, and even the Uber and Lyft drivers said, hey, we're independent contractors. We want the freedom of being part of the gig economy. They put it on the ballot, and the independent contractors, the Uber and Lyft side, won again, rejecting what the legislature had done previously. So you had two probably more what we would characterize as free market victories in California. Now flip to Florida, and you mentioned it a moment ago. In Florida, Republicans won. President Trump won actually quite easily. Two or three House of Representative Democrats lost their seats in Florida, picked up by Republicans, so you had some switches there. You could say Florida had a red state day. There's no question about it on election day. But the $15 minimum wage was put on the ballot, and it required 60% of the vote to pass, and it ended up getting 61% of the vote. So millions of people that voted for President Trump also voted for an increase in the minimum wage to go up to $15 over the next few years, which again, I think is a little surprising to many. And what it tells me is what the president has done, and it'll be interesting to see if we revert back to normalcy, or old times. I shouldn't say normalcy, but old times. What the president has done is make the Republican Party almost the party of the working class. He, interestingly enough, being a billionaire himself that you might not think of as the working class, he kind of appeals to the working class vote. And that's why I think you saw that happen in Florida, where people were voting for Trump and also voting for an increase in the minimum wage.
what? So explain the California opposite, though. Why do you think that happened?
In California, I think, and this is not necessarily common to just California, I think it's everywhere. In many ways, there is a disconnect between who people vote for and some of the basic ideology that they hold themselves. I think in California, people vote very liberally, but they also don't necessarily want to see, they're not going to vote themselves a tax increase, even though their elected officials routinely do it. They're not going to vote themselves a tax increase. Teague, we also saw the exact same thing happen in the state of Illinois, which you would probably say, at least from an electoral standpoint, is as progressive as California. In the state of Illinois, on the ballot was a measure to increase taxes on the way it was characterized by the governor on only the wealthy, and that was voted down as well. In fact, voted down significantly in the state of Illinois. So Illinois, a very deep blue state, voted against the tax increase as well. So I think the message that comes out of this is kind of a message that you've heard over the last few decades. People generally like to describe themselves as socially moderate and fiscally conservative. Most people, in fact, say that's the way that they are. You're seeing that form its way in the ballot box with people voting fairly moderate, if not liberal in many cases, but then when given the opportunity to vote on a fiscal issue, voting pretty conservative.
All right, this is fun. Let's keep going. Give me some other props that are working. I mean, California's voting opposite, Florida's voting opposite, Illinois. Give me some other props that we might be shocked.
So we go to Arizona, where interestingly enough, I'm going to look at Arizona and Colorado, interestingly enough, where Arizona flipped this time. Well, we'll see. The counting still continues there, but Arizona is probably at the end of this election counting process, and it keeps going on and on, will be the closest state in America. That's what I predict. It will be down to maybe 1,000 votes either way to decide who won the presidential race in Arizona. By the way, in Arizona, at least one of the two houses flipped from Republican to Democrat. The House of Representatives there, I believe the Arizona Senate stayed Republican. So it is right down the middle. Yet Arizona voted for a tax increase. And we used to think of Arizona years ago as a very conservative, almost libertarian state. If you think back to presidential politics of the 1960s, it was certainly one of the more libertarian states back then. And yet they just voted a tax increase. Just north of them in Colorado, you also had a vote against, for a state that is increasingly turning blue, you had a vote against a tax increase and an attack on what they have there, which is known as TABOR, Taxpayer Bill of Rights, that prevents the state from spending additional money that they don't have. And they voted down a tax increase in Colorado. So as you look across the spectrum, it almost made no sense that you have minimum wage increase being voted up in a red state, tax increases voting down in blue states, and then a reddish, bluish, purple state in Arizona voting for a tax increase.
Yeah, even more acknowledgement that I have no idea what's going on.
I'm not sure anybody could have predicted any of this.
Who knows? All right, maybe we get into some of the other tax sort of things that may come. Important to our industry, the 1031 exchange, okay, income tax, okay, capital gains tax. Any insight as to what might happen on those?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I'll just make this really, really simple. If the Democrats control the U.S. Senate, and this is not my opinion, this is what they've stated they want to do. The Democrats control the U.S. Senate. They will get rid of the Trump tax cuts, which mean corporate tax rates will go back up. There's no question about it. Individual tax rates will go back up. And then we really will look at this capital gains tax increase probably happening. But the 1031 like-kind exchange may be on the chopping block as well. Now, look, we have fought on this issue for years. We have done the academic studies to show that the 1031 exchange actually ultimately brings more money into the government. Because think about what a 1031 exchange does, and Teague, you know this better than anybody. If you get rid of it, all it does is put a hurdle to real estate transactions. It just makes a real estate transaction more difficult, more costly, and less likely to happen. So you're slowing down the velocity of transactions. When you slow down the velocity of transactions, you're slowing down the number of times that a property or a transaction can be taxed, right? And when you do that, you ultimately send fewer dollars to the government. And what you're really doing is encouraging people to hold on to a piece of property that they otherwise would not hold on to if it were not for the tax implications involved in exchanging that property. And so it's a terrible tax. And that's why the 1031 exchange has been so profitable through the years. It allows people to make those real estate transactions almost like inventory that you would see in a retail shop, to make those real estate transactions without having to pay those taxes at the time of the transaction and delaying that tax liability to a later date. It has worked for over 100 years. It has been extremely helpful to the real estate industry, and it has brought in more money to the government. So the idea of getting rid of it really makes no sense whatsoever, but it could be on the chopping block if the Democrats control the U.S. Senate. So again, the real simple message on taxes is this. If the Republicans control the Trump tax cuts are almost certainly to stay in place. If the Democrats control the Trump tax cuts are almost certainly going to be done away with.
Okay. All right. Got it. So
now, on the other issues, if you want me to get into those, I think
sure, let's go.
At the top of the list has to be labor. I don't think that you could draw a more distinct difference between two presidents and their ideologies on organized labor than you had under the Trump administration, or have under the Trump administration now, and that you would have under the Biden administration in January. Biden has said himself, and again, this is not me putting words in his mouth, these are his own words, that he would be the most pro-labor president in U.S. history. Now, could he possibly follow through on that? Well, he will certainly have the power to do so in remaking the National Labor Relations Board, of course, remaking the U.S. Department of Labor. Now, there will be a lot of things at play if that happens. You're going to see card check come back. You're going to see the joint employer issue certainly going to come back almost immediately. These are things that are going to impact our industry from day one. Now, the best way to look at this is to say, what has happened? Where can we see an example of this type of union-backed ideology already at play? And I would point to the state of California. If you look at California and the influence that organized labor has on the cities, the counties, and even the state in California, and what that has meant to the hotel industry, that type of scenario would become national if the policies of California are then placed at the federal level, which is what President-elect Biden has suggested that he wants to do. And so there is no greater difference between these two candidates, or I should say two gentlemen, and their approach on a policy than with respect to organized labor.
All right. What other policies might a Biden administration enact or try to enact that might impact our hotel industry?
So immigration is going to be much, much different. You're going to see an executive order on DACA almost immediately from the Biden administration. They'll probably be challenged in the courts, but I suspect they'll write it in a way that they'll be victorious in their challenge in courts. So you're going to see that. You may see, because of the closeness of the elections, there's finally a serious immigration reform package put forth. The president-elect has suggested he would like to do that. And so you're almost certainly going to see that. The continuation of building the border wall on the southern border almost certainly will come to an abrupt halt. So on immigration, you're going to see a big difference between the two, between the Trump ideology and the Biden ideology. Now, the one I think is most interesting and where they're very similar that impacts our industry is what we would probably characterize as big tech. So the Trump administration, for reasons altogether different than the Biden administration, has had some serious problems with big tech. The Biden administration, or the incoming administration, probably will as well. In fact, you've seen many leading Democrats very concerned about the influence that the big tech leaders, especially around social media, have on the economy, have on society, and in particular our industry, especially with Section 230. So there is a situation that I think is going to play out regardless of whether Biden wins, and it certainly looks like he has won, or if the courts were to somehow overturn this and Trump was back in office. I don't think it would matter. There's going to be a big focus on big tech, and I think both of those gentlemen and their administrations have pretty much the same view.
Okay. All right. Talk to me about the topic near and dear to your heart, stimulus. Are we going to get any more for our industry? Are we going to get any more for our country?
So, yeah, the good news is that with respect to the PPP, it's looking pretty good. I would put it at a better than 50% chance that we see something during the month of December. So the House and Senate will be back after Thanksgiving. They've got to pass a continuing resolution to keep the government funded. And we believe that a PPP stands a really good chance of being attached to that. We certainly hope so. Keep in mind, before all of the election nonsense started, everyone generally agreed on a PPP. It was the other facets of a large package where the Democrats and Republicans disagreed. But what you saw happen immediately after the election, in fact, the day after the election, Senator McConnell, who was quite easily victorious in his race, came out and said, look, we've got to get something done by the end of the year. That was followed up by Speaker Pelosi, really echoing the same sentiments. And so we're hoping that at a minimum, they can agree on a PPP. Now, what's interesting, and I mentioned this on a webinar yesterday, was, prior to the election, President Trump was not the problem with respect to the deal. Keep in mind that Mnuchin and Pelosi came very close to striking the deal. The president would have signed anything they put on his desk because he needed it. He wanted it. He wanted to have a victory going into the election. The problem was the Republican Senate was not going to agree to that deal. The president was actually lining up more closely with Pelosi than he was with McConnell, especially on the overall numbers, getting close to about 1.8 trillion when she was asking for 2.2 trillion. So I don't think the president is going to be a problem between now and during the lame duck session. So if you can have McConnell and Pelosi come to an agreement, I think the president will sign anything on his desk. Then what I believe we will see, Teague, is in January, you're going to see a much larger package contemplated that's going to deal with unemployment benefits. It's going to deal with state and local. Hopefully, it will deal with some sort of liability protection that we desperately need. I want to talk about that in just a second, why it's so important. But liability protection that Senator McConnell has talked about all along. That larger package, I think, is much more likely to happen in late January or early February. But maybe during the lame duck, we can get the PPP for hotels.
The fiscal conservative in me gets concerned about all the money we're spending. How concerned should I be and we be?
Well, I don't think on PPP you should be that concerned. I think on a larger deal, there is certainly something to be said for being fiscally concerned about where we are with the debt, which is now $27 trillion with no possible way of repaying. And that is for another show. And you and I can talk about monetary and fiscal policy. And it's something that back in my geek days at Georgia Tech, I would have loved to talk about. And I'm glad to relive that with you. But with respect to the PPP, I don't think you have to worry about it too much. Some of it ultimately would get repaid, and the package they're looking at is not really that large. But I do want to talk about what we need to look at with respect to liability protection and why that is so important. Look, Teague, you and I know that the only ultimate solution to the problems that our industry faces is to get the economy going again, get people traveling again. So you really have a two-pronged problem here, and this is what I remind elected officials about all the time. Prong number one is that hotels, restaurants, and others that are consumer-facing are concerned about the notion that they would face lawsuits. In fact, some of these lawsuits have already begun. They would face lawsuits from people suggesting that they got COVID-19 or the coronavirus while at that business, at that hotel. Now, that, of course, is almost impossible to predict. But the reality is these hotels would be settling these out of court, making these payments that they don't need to make even before it ever got to court. So that's problem one. Problem two, which I like to call prong two of this problem, is the fact that employers who need to send their employees out on business and kind of reignite that business travel are not doing so because they're feared of getting sued over sending those employees out traveling again. And so for those two reasons, we need to have liability protection that gives both employers and business owners some sort of protection against lawsuits that are only meant to end up in settlements anyway. And so if we could get that limited liability protection for a limited period of time, specifically dealing with coronavirus for both employers and businesses who have done the right thing, then I think you're going to have that's going to significantly help our economy, especially travel.
All right, I'll buy all that.
And by the way, we've got 13 states that have already done that.
Great. Let's get more.
Yes, 37.
All right, and not that this has been great, Chip. Thank you. Not that you're a doctor, but I'll ask you, what's your take on we got a vaccine, 90% Pfizer, and a therapeutic and some other announcements. I don't know if that's coincidence or not, but
not a doctor.
That's going to be.
Yeah, not a doctor. Did not stay at Holiday Inn Express last night, though I love Holiday Inn Express. Look, that was great news coming out from Pfizer and BioNTech. And they seem to have the lead right now. But look, there are 8 viable vaccines that I see could be successful within the next 3 to 4 months. That's all good because this is both medical and psychological. There's a lot of people that are simply looking for the existence of a vaccine to return to their normal life, and that's really important psychologically for the country, for the world. Second thing is, and I think this gets overlooked a little bit too much, is there are therapeutics out there. If you look at the number of people who are dying that actually have coronavirus, that percentage of folks has come down significantly. And it's come down because our medical community, the geniuses that they are, have figured out how to treat this in many ways that we just didn't know back in February or March. And so those therapeutics are actually working in making this a less deadly disease, or less deadly condition, which is really, really important. And then the third thing that I think is really contributing and can contribute in a major way is inexpensive, very reliable, and almost instant testing. And so we know that the products exist where you can get reliability of close to 98% on tests that can be done, administered with the results coming back in less than 5 minutes at costs under $5. Now, once we get that distributed across the US and across the world, think about the doors that opens up. People getting on an airplane can get tested immediately right there in the airport and still get on that plane. And you as a traveler can have confidence knowing I'm getting on a plane and nobody in this plane has coronavirus. Same thing at a hotel, at a restaurant, at a music venue, at a sports stadium. If you have instant testing that is reliable and cheap, it opens up a lot of doors that are not open up right now.
So give me timing of that. When is all that?
Well, look, the technology already exists. It's how do you manufacture it and get it distributed. So on the vaccine side, I mean, Operation Warp Speed, whether you like the president or not, or think he handled this well or not, you have to give him, his administration, and everybody involved in Warp Speed some credit for trying to pull off not just creation of the vaccine, but the greatest distribution effort in the history of mankind. If the US military can pull this off, we will have a vaccine that is distributed at least to those who are most vulnerable by first quarter next year. That is absolutely amazing. I mean, no one could have thought that hundreds of millions of these could be distributed, doses could be distributed that quickly. Therapeutics, I mean, it happens every single day. They're getting better and better. And we've got to thank the medical professionals across the country that are doing this. And then with the testing, I had a chance just a few weeks ago to talk to the gentleman who's leading the effort on the Oxford study, but also he's the main advisor to Boris Johnson in the UK. And they've already purchased billions of these tests, or I should say hundreds of millions of tests, billions of dollars worth of these tests, or billions of pounds worth of these tests. And so that distribution is happening there. It's going to happen in the US as well. And I think it was one of the major airlines just announced recently they're going to start implementing that test to increase travel between New York and London. And so you're going to see it happen probably within the next 2 to 3 months, Teague, that these tests are going to become prevalent just about everywhere.
I love it. I love it. And on that note, I'm going to end on a positive note. Chip, you're the man. You're a wealth of knowledge. You're an incredible leader for our industry. Thank you very much for carrying the flag, for championing, for being the voice for all of us. And for communicating, for coming on and communicating to the industry. We need a person fighting for us, and we appreciate the communication.
Thank you, Teague. Thanks for what you do. I always love coming on the show. Anytime you need me, I'm here.
We'll keep it up. Thanks,
right,
Chip.
thank
You're the man.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.